Today is Tuesday, 15th October, and as of today, as at the moment of making of this program, we still have not had the promised Israeli strike on Iran. What we are getting instead are reports in the Washington Post that there have been discussions between the Americans and the Israelis, and that the Israelis supposedly have told the Americans that Israel does not intend to conduct strikes, airstrikes or missile strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities or against facilities of Iran's sprawling energy complex. Well, apparently there are also uncertainties in the United States as to whether or not these Israeli assurances can be fully relied upon. There are suggestions that the US decision to deploy the 48 THAAD interceptor missiles to Israel was some kind of quid pro quo that the United States offered and gave the Israelis in return for this Israeli assurance not to conduct strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities and energy installations. But as I say, it all seems somewhat tentative at the moment. But for what it's worth, we're told that when the Israeli strike does take place, it will be focused exclusively on Iranian military targets. Now that begs actually many questions. Firstly, to repeat a point I have made before, Iran is a huge country. It is, I believe, the biggest country in the Middle East in terms of territory. I may be wrong there, but that's my understanding. It is a huge country. It is also a geographically very complex country. There are areas of great cities like Tehran and Shiraz and places like that. There's obviously the coastline. There are areas of desert. There are large areas that are extremely mountainous, places where my guess is it would be quite straightforward to hide sensitive installations. There are other areas which are very heavily forested, and the Iranian military itself is very big. It is a big military. I'm not saying that translates necessarily into an effective military, perhaps it does, but it is a very big military. There are large numbers of components of it. It's located in many different places across this enormous territory. One can imagine strikes being undertaken against particular locations where the Iranian military is located without actually much damage being done to the whole. And one can imagine also that some strikes could be launched against relatively large and important Iranian military installations, airfields, command bunkers, that sort of thing. But again, one does wonder how effective strikes against individual installations like that, how effective they would actually be. And, well, one could perhaps envisage something on a very, very big scale indeed, a major air campaign across the whole of Iran. But does Israel by itself have the resources to do that? How effective is the Iranian air defense system, which does exist? I'm not in a position to speculate as to how effective it is, but if the Israelis were to conduct airstrikes against Iranian military installations, I'm guessing that these would be amongst the most heavily defended, at least the most important installations would be. How much damage, actual damage, can Israel really do in a single strike, however big it is? And does Israel really have the resources to conduct a sustained air campaign of the kind that would significantly degrade Iran's military capabilities? I ask this question because obviously the Russians have been conducting a major missile and bombing offensive across Ukraine. Admittedly, I believe territorially a bigger country than Iran, just saying. And the Russians, according to Zelensky, use around 900 bombs, I believe, a week now. And by the way, for the record, Russian bombs, Russian fab bombs, seem to be bigger and heavier than US bombs. Apparently, the great bulk of the bombs that Israel uses in its various strikes are US built 1,000 and 2,000 pound bombs. The 2,000 pound bombs, which are typically the heaviest bombs that Israel uses, would weigh around, just under 1,000 kilos. But the largest number of bombs appear to be the most heavily used bombs are the 1,000 pound bombs. Well, the Russians use 250 kilo bombs and 500 kilo bombs. Apparently it's the 500 kilo bombs that are particularly heavily used. And of course they also use, on a significant scale, 1,500 and even 3,000 kilo bombs. And as I said, they conduct massive missile offensives against Ukraine. We're basically round the clock now. And yes, this missile and air campaign is steadily degrading and weakening Ukraine's military capabilities and its economic capabilities as well. But as we see, it's been a long, exhausting process. It's taken years to achieve, to start having the kind of effect that we're seeing at present. The Russian missile and bomb campaign against Ukraine began in earnest in the autumn of 2022, and we're now in the autumn of 2024. How long would it take Israel to conduct a similar campaign against Iran and to achieve the same effects that the Russians have achieved in Ukraine, that it's taken the Russians with their many missiles and their heavier bombs and their powerful air force? It's taken them 2 years to bring Ukraine to its present condition. How long would it take the Israelis to achieve the same in Iran? And I ask that question because I don't know, but I would have thought that Israel, a much smaller country than Russia, without the same depth of resources that Russia has, I would have thought that by themselves they will struggle to sustain such an air campaign, and that isn't taking into account Iran's air defense system, about which I know very little. So anyway, there we go. These are the questions. We will see what exactly is done. I wonder whether it is going to be quite as straightforward as people, or at least the Washington Post is implying. After all, Gallant did talk about a powerful, precise, and surprising strike. I still sense that it's more likely to be some kind of decapitation strike targeting top Iranian military and political leaders, which could be packaged, I suppose, as an attack on Iranian military installations, rather than the kind of campaign against military targets that the Russians are conducting in Ukraine, and which the Washington Post is sort of leading us to think that the Israelis are likely to conduct against Iran. Of course, going back to what Gallant said about it being a surprising strike, could it be that the Israelis really are stringing the Americans along again? That these articles in the Washington Post are being planted in order to give the Iranians completely the wrong idea about what is coming? After all, telling the Iranians in advance that it's their military targets that are going to be attacked, as opposed to their oil installations and their nuclear facilities, in effect makes the attack less surprising. Anyway, we will have to see. What is also interesting is this suggestion that is now being floating around, that the United States put pressure on Israel to limit the extent of its strike, and that the decision by the United States to deploy the THAAD missile battery with its 48 interceptor missiles to Israel was intended as some kind of quid pro quo, that the Americans in effect told the Israelis, look, if you reduce the scope of your strike, we will provide you with some information and assistance in carrying it out, and we will also supplement your air defenses by deploying this THAAD missile battery. And on that issue, there has been a really interesting article in the Financial Times, which goes directly to the point that both I and others, notably Brian Paletic, have been making for some time. And the article reads, Israel races to supply anti-missile shield. Intense war demands have left the IDF relying on the US to fill gaps in air defenses. And then the article goes on to say, Israel faces a looming shortage of interceptor missiles as it shores up air defenses to protect the country from attacks by Iran and its proxies, according to industry executives, former military officials and analysts. And this supposedly explains the deployment of the THAAD missiles to Israel. There is, we're told, a shortage of missiles. Dana Stroul, former senior US defense official with responsibility for the Middle East, is quoted by the Financial Times as saying, Israel's munitions issue is serious. If Iran responds to an Israeli attack with a massive airstrike campaign and Hezbollah joins in too, Israel's air defenses will be stretched. The US can't continue supplying Ukraine and Israel at the same time. We are reaching a tipping point. And we also read that the Israeli industry is now working round the clock to try to keep the Israeli air defense system, the Iron Dome, the David Sling, the Arrow systems, supplied with interceptor missiles. We have a quote from Boad Levy, who is chief of Israel Aerospace Industries, which makes the Arrow interceptors. Some of our lines are working 24 hours, 7 days a week. Our goal is to meet all our obligations. The time required to produce interceptor missiles was not a matter of days. He won't disclose the size of Israel's stockpiles, but he says it is no secret we need to replenish stocks. And then there's a long discussion about the nature of the Israeli air defense system and how sophisticated and advanced it is. But then we're told that problems do exist. There's an analysis, a discussion of the Hezbollah drone attack that I mentioned in my program yesterday, the one that got through. The Daily Telegraph, by the way, has written an article of its own talking about how the Israeli defense system, air defense system, is not really designed to deal with drone storms. Very different from the Russian system, by the way, in that case. But that this is why these drones manage to get through. And then there's discussions about the kind of things that can be done to provide defense against drones. And then that takes me back to my long discussion yesterday about how the Russians have a depth of operational experience in developing their air defense system, which the much more new and raw Israeli air defense system does not have. And then the Financial Times quotes Asaf Orion, former Israeli brigadier general and head of strategy at the Israeli Defense Forces. He talks about Hezbollah. He says this: "We are not seeing Hezbollah's full capability yet. It has only been firing at around a tenth of its estimated pre-war launching capacity. A few hundred rockets a day instead of as many as 2,000. Some of that gap is a choice by Hezbollah not to go full out. Interesting admission. Some of it is due to degradation by the IDF. But Hezbollah has enough left to mount a strong operation. Haifa and northern Israel are still on the receiving end of rocket and drone strikes almost every day." And then we're told that the Israelis have had to parry attacks by up to 20,000 rockets and missiles over the past year, since military operations began in October last year. And then it all ends, rather alarmingly, with this quote from Ehud Elam, former researcher at Israel's Ministry of Defense. "During the October 1st attack, there was a sense the IDF reserved some arrow interceptors in case Iran fired its next salvo at Tel Aviv. It is only a matter of time before Israel starts to run out of interceptors and has to prioritize how they are deployed." And the overall sense of this Financial Times article is that that time, in effect, is now. The Israelis are already starting to run short of interceptor missiles. Their industry, which, bear in mind, as I've said many times, that Israel is a small country, 9 million people. It doesn't have enormous industrial capacities like Russia does. Israel cannot produce these very sophisticated and very complex air defense missiles at anything like the kind of rate that would be required to keep up with the level of use. So there we are. A problem, a looming problem for Israel. And, well, we've seen the American deployment of the THAAD systems. This article in the Financial Times tells us straightforwardly that the US sent the THAAD interceptors to Israel precisely because the Israelis are starting to run out of interceptor missiles, and therefore the THAAD missiles had to be sent to Israel in order to close the looming gaps in the air defense system. Now, I've received over the last couple of hours huge numbers of articles, and one in particular from a extremely kind and regular correspondent in India, just to say, huge explanations and discussions about how the THAAD system operates. I'm still working through them. I should say that all of these comments, they provide a lot of detail, but they all seem to, in effect, support and complement each other. So anyway, I'm still working through all of these comments, but simply to say this, there are not many of these systems. Now, yesterday, I discussed in my program certain comments that I had seen attributed to Brian Beletic. I will disclose that I've had some correspondence on this with Brian himself. I am not going to go into the details of this correspondence simply because I expect that he is going to be discussing this further himself shortly. I don't want to anticipate what he says, and besides, I don't think one should start discussing in too much detail what is said between us in private. Anyway, what I will say is this. Essentially, Brian, along with all of the others, confirm the same thing. There are not that many THAAD interceptor missiles in existence, and the production rate is low. In fact, you can already obtain all of that from the open sources. Now, I'm not going to go into the figures because, as I said, I expect Brian to go into all of that himself soon. But shall we say that they're not significantly different or orders of magnitude different from what I had speculated or talked about in my program yesterday? So, coming back to what is happening with Israel, we can see that the United States is rushing air defense systems to Israel, but its own stockpiles are not going to be sufficient to keep up with potential need, the potential demand, if a major missile war between Israel and Iran gets going. And coming back to this article, it straightforwardly admits that there is now a problem with stocks. Just to repeat again what Dana Stroul, former senior US defense official with responsibility for the Middle East, says, if Iran responds to an Israeli attack with a massive airstrike campaign and Hezbollah joins in too, Israeli air defenses will be stretched. US stockpiles are not limitless. The US can't continue supplying Ukraine and Israel at the same time. We are reaching a tipping point. Brian Beletic has been saying this for 2 years, that we would reach a tipping point. We would eventually reach a tipping point. To a lesser degree, I've been saying this as well. Now you have Dana Stroul, a former senior US official. She is quoted by the Financial Times as saying it. And in fact, she's talking about the fact that we are reaching a tipping point. I'm going to suggest that we are in fact already there. So we come back, therefore, to the true reason why there's been this delay in the Israeli missile strike on Iran, and why we see all of these discussions going on between the United States and the Israelis. Yes, I do believe that there are tensions between the Israelis and the Americans. I've already discussed this. I don't believe that this is all smoke and mirrors intended to deceive. I'm not going to rehearse all of that again. The problem the Americans and the Israelis face, which they have now found themselves confronting, is that it's going to be incredibly difficult to knock out Iran with a single blow. The expectations, perhaps the expectations that Hezbollah would collapse quickly, have not been met. There's uncertainty, perhaps, as to how strong the political system in Iran actually is. I'm going to here venture my own guess. I think it is going to prove to be both strong and resilient in the face of an air campaign. That is overwhelmingly my own sense. And the reality is that if the United States and Israel get drawn into a long war with Iran, then based on what we are told about Iranian stockpiles, based upon what we know about the scale of Iran's industrial capabilities, based on the fact that Iran is now forging powerful regional alliances with industrial superpowers like China and Russia. In a prolonged war, the advantage over time, perhaps not over very much time, will start to shift in favor of Iran. And I suspect that this, more than anything else, is the true reason why this delay is taking place. The Americans and the Israelis were taken aback by the effectiveness of the Iranian missile strike the 1st October. By the way, the Financial Times article admits this. Israel had less success fending off a second Iranian barrage of over 100 ballistic missiles fired on October 1st. Almost 36 missiles. In other words, we see now that we're talking about 26 missiles. The number gradually creeps up with each article. Almost 36 missiles hit Israel's Nevatim airbase. 36 missiles hit one airbase. It's a huge, sprawling airbase. I discussed how in an earlier program how it has 4 airfields and extends over a territory of 50 square kilometers. So we're talking about a massive facility, but it's still just one facility, and 26 missiles at least apparently hit their targets there. And the Financial Times does say that this is according to open source intelligence analysts, and then it accepts that one missile exploded 700 meters away from the headquarters of Mossad, and many people have pointed out that this was almost certainly done intentionally, that the Iranians probably intended that they would not attack the Mossad building itself. So the Israelis and the Americans have been taken aback by the scale, the effectiveness, and by the way, the precision of the Iranian strike. They're probably busy worrying and speculating and talking with each other about whether the Iranians obtained satellite and data and guidance from the Russians. I think the short answer to that is almost yes. They're probably also wondering, did Iran get help from the Russians in developing their hypersonic missile capabilities? I think the answer to that is quite possibly, but I'm not going to pretend I know for sure. But anyway, one way or the other, they were shocked, I think that's not too strong a word, by the power of this Iranian missile strike. And that is now giving them pause. They're wondering about their own ability to keep parrying missile strikes like this, if they continue to happen. They're aware of the general shortage of interceptor missiles, and they cannot risk politically the same thing happening to Israel as has happened to Ukraine, where the Ukrainian air defense system has broken down, where there are so few missiles left that Ukraine is only able to provide limited defense to certain key targets. Israel politically cannot risk that happening. The United States politically cannot risk that happening to Israel. And so they're all wringing their hands, trying to work out what to do. They know they have to do something, and they can't make up their minds. Now, all of that may sound reassuring, but in some respects it's not, because I talked about the idea of a major airstrike, air campaign against Iran. I've said that Israel does not have the means to do that by itself. I think that there remain powerful voices within Israel, within Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, that most definitely does want that wider war, that major air campaign against Iran. I've been saying for months that their plan is to try to get the Americans directly involved in that air campaign, which they know Israel does not have the resources to conduct by itself. And this is another concern about that THAAD missile deployment. And here I'm going to mention an article by Andrew Karibko. He has made the point that the fact that the United States has sent one THAAD missile launch battery with 100 American soldiers to operate it, putting them in effect in the line of fire, it has very much the look of a tripwire about it. He speculates, and perhaps he's right to, that some of the people who have pushed for this deployment, unwise as it looks, are almost inviting an Iranian attack on these troops in order to justify America joining Israel in an attack on Iran. Now, I have to say, if that is true, then it would speak of a degree of cynicism and ruthlessness on the part of some decision makers in the United States. The idea that they would put the lives of American soldiers intentionally at risk in order to open up the prospect of a war against a country as powerful as Iran. Well, if they think like that and they're capable of making those kind of decisions, then straightforwardly, I would find it chilling. But I have to say, I've followed and studied and read and seen what these people are like over many years. I'm afraid I can believe that some of them would be prepared to do this thing. So we remain in a very dangerous position. The very fact that the Iranian missile strike was as effective as it was, quite plausibly, is going to lead some people in the United States, and of course in Israel itself, to say, look, the fact that the Iranians are even stronger than we believed simply proves that they're even more of a threat to us than we had previously been saying. That means we have to act now before they become stronger still, and whilst the balance remains to our advantage. So we need to go in all out and launch this big war before the opportunity to do so finally closes, as Iran completes its strategic partnership with Russia, starts importing weapon systems, advanced weapon systems from the Russians on a regular basis before Iran becomes too strong, in other words, to attack. So those pressures, I am sure, are there. And, well, I would like to believe that no one in Washington would be as cynical and as ruthless as to put Americans in the line of fire in order to get that war started now. But I'm afraid, though I don't want to believe it, I'm afraid that I think the possibility that some people might do this thing, this awful thing, that it actually very much does exist. So anyway, we remain in this very tense situation at the present time. Now, I said that there are people in Israel, certainly in Israel, and some people in Washington also, who have been agitating for a war against Iran. They've been agitating for it for a long time. I think the Iranians, by the way, believe that it's coming, that the Israelis and the Americans, or some Americans, are determined to have this war, and that they are going to make sure that they get this war. Anyway, another factor that makes me think that this plan to start the war is indeed there goes back to the other topic that I discussed in my program yesterday, which is this whole affair of the stories about Iranian missile deliveries to Russia and Russian air defense missile deliveries to Iran, which I'm now coming round to believing were untrue. These reports appeared in the United States over the last couple of months. There have been now categorical denials from the Iranians. The Iranian foreign minister, as I discussed yesterday, has categorically denied the claim that Iran has supplied ballistic missiles to Russia. And by the way, there is no visible sign of Iranian ballistic missiles being used by the Russians in Ukraine, in the battlefields in Ukraine, for the moment at least. And I've come round to the view that no such deliveries have in fact been made. So the question comes back to us, where did those reports come from? And I'm going to suggest that they came from the same nexus of people that I've been talking about. The hardliners in Israel and their friends in the United States. They're back to their old games, going all the way back to the WMD stories about Iraq that we saw 20 plus years ago. That there's this enormous, terrifying build-up that the Iranians are sending advanced rockets to the Russians, that the Russians are sending advanced air defense missiles to the Iranians, that these two parts of the axis of the West's enemies are now busy working together, planning some nefarious thing with each other, and therefore it's essential in its own self-defense that the West acts and takes the action against both of these countries, but principally against Iran, the weaker country, before this alliance, this putative alliance between the Iranians and the Russians goes further still. So that is what I've come to think about that. And of course, the fact that some people seem to be behaving in this way, as I said, inventing and circulating stories about arms deliveries which haven't happened. That is another reason, or so it seems to me, for thinking that they're dead set on a war with Iran and that they're taking steps all the time to bring that war closer. There's one last factor which I would just mention. I'm now going even further into the world of speculation than I occasionally do. But it's a point I'm going to make, which is a psychological one, which is that, of course, this current administration in Washington is ending its term with all of its various projects in a state of seeming failure. The crisis with China has been deteriorating, but the United States has not been able to build up alliances in the Far East against China with any real degree of success. I read a long discussion recently about how the American project to create a defense line against China in the Pacific along the first island chain has essentially collapsed. Chinese military power is now too strong to make that an effective, defendable barrier, and Chinese economic and trading power has won over enough of the countries that would form part of this chain to compromise the chain's entire existence. And of course, we've just had another huge demonstration of Chinese naval power with recent exercises that the Chinese Navy has conducted around Taiwan, where the Chinese Navy has again rehearsed a blockade of Taiwan on a scale that they've not done before. So the Biden administration, the administration is looking at all of this. They see that things have not worked out as they hoped they would. They see that the Chinese and the Indians are talking to each other, that both China and India are going to move forward at the BRICS summit together. So that hasn't quite worked out. They're also aware that Project Ukraine has failed. The various attempts, both the diplomatic attempts that were made in the first half of 2021 and the subsequent attempts through sanctions, regime change, military conflicts in Ukraine to break the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, to peel the Russians off from China. That has failed also. The war in Ukraine is about to be lost. So what's left? What can the administration do to retrieve both its reputation as a successful foreign policy administration in the last months that's left to it, and in order to advance its great geopolitical project of undermining this system of economic, political, and ultimately security and military related alliances that the Chinese and to some extent the Russians are weaving around themselves. On that front, by the way, I should say that the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, is currently in Beijing. He's had meetings with the Chinese Defense Minister and other Chinese military officials. The Chinese have spoken about the importance of enhancing Russian-Chinese military cooperation. In other words, exactly the opposite of what the administration sought to do when it took office. So they see failure in everything they've tried. They also, of course, still carry the criticism for their earlier retreat, their disorganized retreat from Afghanistan. So what do? Well, perhaps one last throw of the dice, some kind of attempt to destabilize Iran, to break the Iranian part of the BRICS, the process of BRICS construction and Eurasian construction. It's not quite as big a prize as Russia would be, but if you can achieve regime change in Iran, well, it's a big enough prize so they can all walk away and leave office and think that they have nonetheless somehow managed in the time that they've been there to achieve something. So I would not be surprised if there are some people within the administration who are thinking and talking like that. I'm not saying, by the way, that they are the only ones. I've already said that, in my opinion, the Pentagon, the military people, probably reject this sort of thinking outright. They want to just go ahead and focus on China and forget about Iran and Russia and Ukraine and all of those things. But I can imagine that there are some people who do think like that, who have visceral feelings anyway about Iran and about the Middle East. And they're busy pushing for war, and they're getting the THAAD systems deployed to Israel, and they're probably joining whatever lobbying is taking place behind the scenes by the Israelis for the big attack on Iran. Anyway, there we are. Very interesting article in the Financial Times about the limitations of the air defense capabilities, both of Israel and ultimately of the United States and the West. I discussed all of that at great length in my program yesterday. It's interesting and even amusing in some respects to see all one's speculations confirmed in an article the following day in the Financial Times. Not that they really are speculations. As I said, Brian Beletic has done a lot of hard work on this issue, and we all owe him a great deal in terms of the information that he's managed to put together on this topic. But anyway, we see the problems of limitations and the effect that they may be having on decision making. Not that limits on US military capabilities have ever, in the end, caused the hardliners, the neocons, and people like that in Washington to retreat. In the end, they always ignore those sort of constraints. They pretend to themselves that they don't exist. They act on the assumption that, as the president himself once said, if push comes to shove, if the United States needs to produce more weapons, it just can. After all, it is the United States, and it is heresy, prohibited heresy, to suggest that perhaps things are more complicated and it cannot. Well, anyway, there we are on the situation in the Middle East. I remain convinced that war is coming, probably in the next couple of weeks, but the fact that there's been this pause has been interesting in itself, and I think with this article in the Financial Times, we can see why. Now, let's turn to that other conflict, the one in Ukraine, and something very interesting is about to happen, which is that Zelensky, coming back from a very unsuccessful trip to Europe, the Ramstein meeting was called off by Biden. We're now having more reports, by the way, in the media in the United States that there is not going to be another Ramstein meeting. There is not going to be a Ramstein meeting in the period that this administration still has. Anyway, Zelensky, having all the doors shut in his face by the Americans, by the Europeans, he's not been given the green light to launch the missiles deep into Russia. He's not got the accelerated pathway into NATO and into the EU that he was demanding. He's not getting more weapon systems from the Europeans. The Germans and the British have said that they're out of weapon systems, that they have no more to give. He's not getting more money. There are problems sorting out the loan. And Speaker Johnson in the United States has said quite openly that he's tired of authorizing funding all the time for Ukraine. All of the doors are being shut on him. So he's going to the Ukrainian parliament, to the Rada, and he is going to address the parliament, and he is going to unveil in public his victory plan. The plan which so far the Western powers have snubbed. And I can't help but think that this is the last desperate attempt, the last throw of the dice by Zelensky. He wants to make the Ukrainians believe that there is still some sort of pathway to victory, that they have a reason to keep fighting, and probably he hopes that by making his victory plan public, he'll be able to get a critical mass of support in the West to back the victory plan and to get this project to press forward with the war, moving to get the authorization for the deep strikes against Russia, to get the process for accelerated entry of Ukraine into NATO and the EU underway. And of course, this speech to the Rada might also serve another purpose, which is, of course, if none of that happens, if the West continues to resist the victory plan, rejects Zelensky's ideas, well, he might finally come back to the Ukrainian people and say to them this: we have fought heroically against the Russians. We have resisted them despite overwhelming odds. We did so in the belief that the West would help us to defend to defend ourselves. We are fighting ultimately for the West itself, but they have let us down. They have not provided us with all the weapons we need so that we can successfully defeat the Russians. We have not been able to push them back in the way that we would have been able to do if we'd been allowed entry into NATO and into the EU, if we'd been allowed to conduct missile strikes deep inside Russia, if the West had given us all the air defense missiles that it promised and all the shells that it promised. The Russians, meanwhile, are getting all the help they need. The Iranians are providing them with missiles. In reality, almost certainly that hasn't happened. But that's what the Ukrainians will say. That's what Zelensky might say. The Russians are getting help from the North Koreans. The North Koreans are providing the Russians with shells. I see no proof of that, by the way. Perhaps it's true. I can believe it, but, I just say I haven't actually seen evidence of that. The North Koreans have provided missiles. Again, I've seen absolutely no evidence of this, none whatsoever. All of those reports were circulating a few months ago, but I've seen no sign of any North Korean weapons being used anywhere by the Russians on the Ukrainian battlefields. The North Korean army is now fighting alongside the Russians. The Ukrainians are now busy promoting that particular story. And surprise, surprise, exactly as I said would be the case a couple of days ago. I said that quite plausibly the Ukrainians are now misrepresenting units made up of volunteers from Russia's Asian regions, people like the Buryats, as North Koreans. Well, surprise, surprise, they're now saying, yes, the Russians are indeed going to recruit a brigade of Buryat fighters to fight specifically in Kursk region, and they're going to be commanded by North Korean officers. Why the Russians would need North Korean officers to command Buryat fighters completely escapes me. I cannot see any logic or sense in that whatsoever. It's not as if North Korean officers would speak the Buryat language, or as if the Buryat fighters would understand the Korean language. The Buryat fighters speak Russian, and they would work with Russian officers, but I can't see how they could work with North Korean ones. But anyway, let's leave all of that aside. Zelensky could say that all of these allies, these powerful allies, are helping the Russians. The Chinese are helping the Russians. They're making weapons for the Russians. All these drones the Russians have are being produced for Russia in China. There's even a Russian factory in China itself churning out drones. Again, I've seen no evidence of this at all. I mean, it may be true. I'm not saying it's not, but I've seen absolutely no actual physical evidence that it is true. But anyway, they can say that. And of course, the Russians do have a very active, in fact, massive and burgeoning trade with China. But anyway, the Russians are getting all of this help from the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians. The Ukrainians, by contrast, have been abandoned by their allies and friends who they were depending upon. We've been betrayed. We've been stabbed in the back. So we have no alternative, my good friends, but to accept the unacceptable and to agree to a freeze of the conflict on the current conflict lines, whereby the Russians retain control of the territories they currently occupy in eastern Ukraine. One day, through diplomacy, after the collapse of Russia, we will get all these places back. But the reality now is that we cannot continue the war, that we're almost exhausted, that our forces cannot continue the fight. They won't accept our victory plan, even though it would deliver them victory. So we have to face the fact that we've been betrayed and abandoned, and we've got to come to terms with the Russians by agreeing to let them occupy our land. Well, I can imagine that might happen. I would say that so far there has been no confirmation of this from the Ukrainian side itself. On the contrary, whenever this idea has been floated, Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky, but also his two spear leaders, Yermak and Podolyak, have come out and have vehemently denied that any such proposal, a ceasefire in return for a freeze on the conflict lines, they've insisted that they will never accept that. And it could be that when Zelensky speaks to the parliament tomorrow, he will not propose any such thing. But against that, there is now increasing amount of commentary on Ukrainian channels, and including, by the way, Ukrainian television channels, basically admitting that the possibility of Ukraine recapturing the territories it has lost in the east does not exist anymore, and that therefore the only realistic option is to agree to this bitter peace, a peace in which the conflict is frozen along the existing conflict line and the Russians remain in occupation of the territory they currently occupy. And I can't help but think that the fact that there is this deluge of commentary on the Ukrainian side talking about all of this, that it would not be happening unless there was some support for it from within the Ukrainian political system. Perhaps not Zelensky himself or his officials, but the other big players, perhaps the various Ukrainian oligarchs, perhaps other Ukrainian parties, perhaps they're all gradually coming round to this view and that they're now in effect lobbying for it. The problem is that it is too late. It is not something that the Russians are going to entertain. And we know that because the Russians have said so. Now, we come back, in effect, in other words, to that extraordinarily prescient article published by Eve Smith in Naked Capitalism. Well, I think it was over a year ago now. Because, of course, the proposal for the conflict, for the freezing of the conflict on the current line of contact is one that has been mooted in the West and which it is clear political figures in the West, including some Western governments, now clearly support. And Eve Smith, in that article in Naked Capitalism, made that exceptionally good point, that what happens in these scenarios, in these kind of scenarios, is that the West, finding it very, very difficult to even agree to negotiations with the other side, it falls into the trap of having protracted, immense, prolonged discussions with itself, in effect trying to negotiate with itself a common position around which everybody can unite, completely losing sight of what the other side might be thinking, so that they eventually come up with a proposal which is acceptable, however grudgingly, to all of them, but which they then discover, to their astonishment, that the other side is simply not interested in. And I think that is exactly where we are, because if Zelensky comes and makes a speech, perhaps not fully tomorrow, but maybe we will see this all develop over the next couple of weeks. Maybe tomorrow he's going to put forward his victory plan and wait and see how the West reacts and how the Ukrainian people react. And if it still appears that the West is not going to go forward with it, then he might start to float his betrayal narrative and begin talk about the freezing of the conflict. And then undoubtedly when that happens, we're going to see all sorts of voices in the West support that. Well, when we get to that point, after all this long process, what they're all going to find, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, the Americans, is that the Russians are going to say no. They've already made that clear. I'm not going to repeat this all over again, but back in June, when he spoke to the Russian Foreign Ministry, Putin said, if you want a negotiation, we're prepared to negotiate. But at the very least, what Ukraine must agree to is to all of the things that we previously agreed to in Istanbul, plus it must accept complete pullback from the entire territory of the 4 regions. So it cannot just be a freeze of the conflict and a ceasefire. And as I discussed recently, in his recent interview to Newsweek, Lavrov, who one must assume is talking after speaking with Putin, he is, after all, not just Russia's foreign minister, but he is a member of Russia's Security Council, its top decision-making body. He is, in other words, not just an executor of policy, he is also a policy maker himself. He will be engaging in all the key foreign policy debates that take place in Moscow. Anyway, Lavrov has now gone beyond what Putin said a couple of months ago, back in June. He says that Ukraine mustn't just pull out of the four regions, it must recognize that the four regions plus Crimea are de jure part of Russia. It must also agree to lift the sanctions on Russia. Some think that means just the sanctions Ukraine has imposed, but Lavrov's his interview to Newsweek didn't say that. I think it means all of the sanctions, including all of the sanctions the West has imposed, and of course all kinds of other huge concessions already made to some extent by Ukraine in Istanbul, but the Russians have clearly indicated that they're going to insist that Ukraine go beyond what was agreed in Istanbul, severe limitations on the size of Ukraine's armed forces, a complete restructuring of the entire Ukrainian political system to extinguish within Ukraine the influence of the ideology of the 1930s and 1940s, which is present in Ukraine and which the Russians take such extreme objection to. Promises about nuclear sites in Ukraine, the Russians wanting conclusive denuclearization of Ukraine, protection for the rights of Russian speakers, full rights for Russian speakers, including an end to the actions the Ukrainian authorities are taking against the Russian Orthodox Church, and more. One of the things that was agreed in Istanbul was the format of the security guarantees that Ukraine would receive. And a key element of those security guarantees was that Russia would be one of the guarantor states, and as a guarantor state would have the right to veto foreign military deployments and maneuvers on Ukrainian territory. And I would not be surprised if the Russians went beyond that, for example, and said that whatever Ukrainian armed forces Ukraine would still be allowed to have once the peace agreement was concluded, it would only be able to equip those forces either with equipment that it produced itself under close watch from Russia, or from equipment supplied by Russia itself. So, I don't think the Russians are going to retreat from much of this. I've no doubt that in the event that there was a negotiation, they might concede on some points. But the Russians have consistently gone out of their way to say that as far as they are concerned, this is not a conflict over territory. It's a conflict over security, by which they mean that Ukraine's integration into NATO, its integration into the Euro-Atlantic system, is for them a key issue, a fundamental red line. And it is also about people, security for Russians in Russia, security for people the Russians now consider Russians in what was Eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, and all of the various safeguards and changes that go along with all of that. Now, I don't, as I said, see that the Russians are going to retreat from this, because to my mind, they've staked out their position so firmly on all of these questions that I think that there would be, major political problems in Moscow, in Russia itself, if they did retreat from them. And to be frank, I don't get the impression that Putin or his officials have any intention of retreating from them. One of the biggest miscalculations that the West made, or some people in the West made, before Macron specifically, to my understanding, is that they grossly underestimated the emotional connection that exists between Russia and Putin specifically, and many Russians, and Ukraine, and some of the people in Ukraine. Supposedly, and we have this on reasonably good authority, back in 2021, when Macron was trying to get Putin to agree to direct negotiations with Zelensky, disregarding Donbass, he actually supposedly told Putin to forget Donbass. He said, Donbass doesn't really matter. Let the Ukrainians take over Donbass. Forget about Minsk, the Minsk agreement. And we can then lift all the sanctions and all will be well. And apparently Putin was furious. He made it as clear as he could that for him, for Russia, the people of Donbass itself, mattered a huge deal. He was not prepared to surrender their interests, which he saw as Russia's interests, and in this he had the support of the vast majority of people in Russia as well. And frankly, I think that if Westerners think that the Russians are going to make some kind of cynical deal of the same kind, then they are deluding themselves. I do accept that there are people in Russia who probably would want to make a deal like that, but I don't think the Russians are going to agree. So, there it is. We are heading towards possible moves to get negotiations started. It's not going to happen realistically before the Kazan meeting, the BRICS meeting in Kazan. But the proposals the Western powers and the Ukrainians are going to put forward are going to fall far short of what the Russians will be prepared to accept. And I don't think this fact, for the moment, is properly understood. So, there we are. What the Western powers will do when the Russians say no, as they will, when the war continues, I don't think they have any idea. I suspect that they still believe that the Russians, in fact they do believe that the Russians have suffered these terrible losses, that the Russians won't be able to sustain the war, that there is in fact a yearning in Russia to end the war quickly. I think that when it turns out otherwise, we will see that if this is plan B, they have no plan C, and that they can't really agree with each other a plan C, and nor can the Ukrainians. To repeat again, the only basis upon which Ukraine can start negotiations are the proposals made by Putin back in June. I think if Ukraine were to signal to the Russians now that it is prepared to accept Putin's June proposal as a framework for discussions, then negotiations could begin on a productive basis. But to be frank, I don't see that for the moment, and for that reason, I expect the war to go on. Anyway, what is in the meantime happening in the war? Well, the latest news, interestingly, seems to focus principally on Chasiv Yar. We're told, this is from a source in the security agencies, has told TASS that there is certain progress in the Chasiv Yar area. We have seized a key interchange to the south of the city. And in fact, there are lots of reports that the Russians, having crossed the Seversky Donetsk aqueduct, having established substantial bridgeheads both to the south and north of Chasiv Yar, are now taking all of the remaining Ukrainian positions in Chasiv Yar into pincers, that they're tightening their control around Chasiv Yar. And it's even been suggested that with Toretsk about to fall, fighting there is still going on apparently in the slag heap and coal mine, but I don't think anybody expects it to continue for very much longer. So with Chasiv Yar about to fall, with Toretsk about to fall, a Russian operation to storm and extinguish all remaining Ukrainian resistance in Chasiv Yar is probably just a short time away. And, well, elsewhere, Abdi Alaudinov, the Chechen commander, he now says that the pocket, the Kursk pocket that Ukraine created in August, has now been halved in size. There are some reports this morning that the village of Lyubimovka has fallen under Russian control. The group of forces north says that the group of forces north are saying that the Russians in the Kursk area have advanced by a further 2.5 kilometers. Again, I don't understand what they mean exactly by this, but pretty much everybody can see that not only has the Kursk operation been a disaster, the Ukrainians having been thrown back from the Glushkovo area and looking like they could soon be surrounded in Suja, but it's a disaster that is now coming to an end, even though it is a disaster that Zelensky himself doesn't seem to be able to give up on. He can't bring himself to abandon. And, well, elsewhere we're getting lots of news, dribbles of information. There's more reports of further Russian advances in the area of the Remivka salient. The Russians have pushed forward further, apparently, on the east bank of the Dnieper in Zaporozhye region. They're gradually edging north towards Zaporozhye. The Russians tightening their grip around the 4 villages northwest of Kurakhovo. There's lots of pictures of the Russian storming operation of Ostrivska to the northwest of Kurakhovo itself. I suspect we're going to get an awful lot more news about what's going on in that area at some point in the next couple of weeks. Couple of days, sorry, not the couple of weeks. And there are also reports that the Russians are now on the brink of capturing the village of Suche Yar, south of Pokrovsk, and that they have cut the road from Selidovo to Kurakhovo, and that this has brought them very close to the point where Selidovo itself is under complete operational encirclement. So as we can see everywhere along the battlefronts, the situation for the Ukrainians goes steadily from bad to worse, and there is no real way, as I've said already, that this situation can be turned round now. So we will see what Zelensky has to say tomorrow, but for the moment at least, the initiative is with the Russians, and I doubt that realistically, or to any extent, the Ukrainians, Zelensky himself, are prepared to address the issues, the real serious issues that they face. I'm going to make a further suggestion. Give Zelensky a piece of advice. I think he needs to call together all the key figures within the Ukrainian government, tell them that the situation is indeed critical for Ukraine, that Ukraine is indeed facing what could be a terminal crisis. And I think what he needs to do is to reach out, obviously to the Russians, let them know that he wants to negotiate. But forget about the West, contact the Brazilians, the Indians and the Chinese, try to speak to them politely for a change and see whether or not they will help him start those negotiations with the Russians that he needs to start without any delay before the final crisis comes. Anyway, this is my program for today. We'll see what happens over the next couple of hours, whether the Israelis do launch their strike against Iran, what Zelensky is going to say tomorrow, whether he's going to say anything interesting at all. And in the meantime, the war in Ukraine grinds on, the Russians continue to advance, and in the Middle East, both sides are preparing their next moves, even as they wait for the next move of the other. So, I'll be back again tomorrow. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.